Hi, my name is Tim Morgan. This is a review of this book, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, a New York Times bestseller and arguably one of the most influential books on atheism written within the last decade. If you found this video, you are probably interested in atheism or the debate between atheism and theism. Maybe you are doing a paper for a class on this book, in which case I hope I have some interesting points for you to consider. If you are interested in both sides of the atheism-theism debate and you would like a good counterpoint to this book, Alistair McGrath has written The Dawkins Delusion, Atheistic Fundamentalism and the Denial of the Divine, which is a response to Richard Dawkins' book. But in this video, I'm just going to walk through the book chapter by chapter and pull out some significant points from Dawkins that are worth a little bit further discussion. So jumping right into chapter 1, which he titles A Deeply Religious Non-Believer, Dawkins opens the first chapter with a story from his childhood about how his Anglican priest from his school as a small boy was in the woods and was overwhelmed by awe of nature in the complexity and diversity of life in the woods, and how that experience led him to pursue the priesthood. And Dawkins wonders out loud how in another time and place Dawkins himself as a child was overwhelmed by, as he says, the stars, dazzled by Horizon, Cassiopeia, Ursa Major, and tearfully as he heard the unheard music of the Milky Way, and that led him into atheism. And he asked the question, why the same emotion should have led my chaplain in one direction and me in the other is not an easy question to answer. And that question is really at the heart of the atheism-theism dialogue, and it's really worth taking a minute to consider. It was Aristotle that said we form our beliefs on the basis of three factors: the intellect, which he called the logos, the emotions, which he called pathos, and our social context, which he referred to as ethos. And as much as both sides of the atheism and theism dialogue would like to believe that their worldview is informed entirely by facts and facts alone, the reality is Aristotle seems to be correct in that our emotions and our social context factor into how we view the world. The American legal system certainly seems to understand that, in that both sides are allowed to dismiss potential jurors before any evidence is submitted if they seem to have preconceived notions regarding the trial, because the court system understands that evidence alone is not strong enough or sufficient to overcome preconceived notions. And Richard Dawkins himself seems to agree with this when he cites the anthropologist Lionel Tiger from Tiger's book, Optimism and the Biology of Hope. Tiger says, there's a tendency for humans conscientiously to see what we wish to see. We literally have difficulty seeing things with negative connotations while seeing things with increased ease that are positive. So my question as I read Dawkins' book is, does he see negative connotations in religion that would have him have trouble believing in it? Well, Dawkins' hatred of religion is pretty obvious in the book, from comments like, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. He describes religion as a time-consuming, hostility-provoking rituals, anti-factual and counterproductive. In an interview with Ben Stein, he calls God a psychotic delinquent, cruel, pathetic, and contemptible. He affirms Thomas Jefferson's description of God as a being of terrific character, cruel, vindictive, capricious, and unjust, and quotes Gore Vidal's comment that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are anti-human and responsible for the loathing of women for 2,000 years in those countries afflicted by the sky god. When Dawkins discusses the influence of religion in our world in this preface, he says, and I quote, "Imagine, with John Lennon, a world with no religion, no suicide bombers, no 9/11, no 7/7, no crusades, no witch hunts, no gunpowder plot, no Indian partition, no Israeli-Palestinian wars, no Serb-Croatian Muslim massacres, no persecution of Jews as Christ killers, no Northern Ireland troubles or honor killings, no shiny-suited, bouffant-haired televangelists fleecing gullible people of their money." It's interesting when he makes this list that Dawkins makes no mention of religious hospitals, orphanages, missionary schools providing free education in countries where children would otherwise not have access to education, Red Cross, the Salvation Army, or numerous other service organizations that are faith-based. Dawkins writes, and I quote, "I'm hostile to fundamentalist religion because it actively debauches the scientific enterprise. It subverts science and saps the intellect." He says, "I'm hostile to religion because of what it did to Kurt Wise, who was a scientist turned creationist." And he says, "The Kurt Wise story is just plain pathetic. Pathetic and contemptible." Now, if Aristotle and Lionel Tiger are correct, then it's not so difficult to understand why Dawkins' chaplain would be led one way while Dawkins himself chose another path. Because Dawkins has some clearly negative connotations toward religion which he must overcome before he can take an honest look at the evidence. Dictionary.com defines objectivity as judgment based on observable phenomenon and uninfluenced by emotions or personal prejudices. And my question to you would be, when Dawkins says that God is a psychotic delinquent, cruel, pathetic, and contemptible, he's anti-human, does that sound like someone that is not influenced by emotions or personal prejudices? I guess what I'm saying is that Dawkins' case would sound much more convincing if it came across as, "My scientific research has led me to the conclusion that God most probably does not exist," instead of the way it does come across, which is, "There is no God and I hate him." Now, an atheist may object and say his motivation doesn't matter as long as he arrives at the right conclusion. But that completely misses Aristotle and Tiger's point that it may not be possible to arrive at the right conclusion unless one has the right motivation. You know, every puzzle has two sides. There's one side that may have a colorful image with a meaningful message. For example, a picture like the roof of the Sistine Chapel of a hand reaching down from heaven. But that puzzle has another side. It has a backside that is gray, empty, and meaningless. And if you start with the preconceived notion that the outcome should be gray, empty, and meaningless, you can make all the pieces line up to fit that notion.